this morning.
I'd like to call to order the City of Riviera Beach Budget Presentation Workshop, Wednesday, June 16th, 6 p.m. Madam Roll Call.
Mayor Ronnie Felder, Chairperson Shirley Lanier, Chair Pro Tem Kashamba Miller Anderson,
Present.
Councilperson Frederick McCoy,
Here.
Councilperson Julia Votel,
Here.
Councilperson Douglas Lawson,
Here.
City Manager Jonathan Evans,
Present.
City Clerk Claudine Anthony is present, Senior Assistant City Attorney Lainey Busby.
Here.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
All right, we'll have a moment of silence followed by the Pledge of Allegiance led by Councilman McCoy. Okay, Mr. Evans.
All right. Good evening, Madam Chair and members of the board. This is our first meeting related to the FY 2021-2022 budget. This presentation will talk about city finances, fire assessment program, and the utility sufficiency study. So as we go through this process, one of the things that I do want to communicate to the board as well as the public, there will be subsequent conversations and more robust discussions with regards to operational elements, capital elements, and then some of the overarching priorities the board has established. One of the things that I think is very important is that we're getting the input and feedback from the board on these two potential revenue opportunities in order to build out the proposed budget. Staff has put together the shell of the budget and is moving forward in a fashion that is going to be able to provide you a document that accomplishes what the collective goals for the board is. One of the things that is important to note is that the budget is a spending plan. At the end of the day, the resources that are collected from the residents are utilized to provide municipal services as well as fund utility operations as well as the CRA. So as we get into the finances of the agency, one of the things that I think is important to see here on this slide is that from 2020 to 2021, the millage rate has decreased by about 11%, but the taxable value has increased by 285%. We know that the Great Recession really impacted municipal governments in about 2009 and then end up seeing improvements back into 2015. We did see the revenues start impacting local governments a little after the economic recovery started, because the way in which government collects its revenue, it usually is about a year behind. So when the recession was hitting the regular public in 2007, municipalities did not start feeling that pinch until later on. As you can see, as a result of the economic downturn, the previous boards did increase the revenues to be able to fund government, and that also was coupled with some measures that reduced operational expenses and looked at personnel modifications to be able to fund municipal government. Right now, our millage rate is 4.8, and staff's recommendation moving into the budget process is for us to continue to keep our millage rate the same. Based on the preliminary property evaluations that we got from the tax collectors or the property appraiser's office, the properties in Riviera Beach increased about 5.03%. For each for each percentage that the millage rate is accounts for, it's roughly about $800,000. So for those folks that are at home trying to calculate, our millage rate is 8.4, and roughly each mill is about $800,000. So as we move to the taxes paid by property owners, this particular slide looks at it based on property evaluations, and then we have our largest taxpayer, which is FPL. So if you look at the property is valued at $75,000 and receives this $50,000 homestead exemption, and you go down that particular column, you will see that the taxes that would be paid to the city of Riviera Beach will roughly be about $211. Realize that there are other taxing authorities. One of the things that we routinely hear from residents and business owners is that their tax bill may be anywhere from $500 to $43,000, but the amount that the city receives is roughly about 38% of the entire tax bill. And so if you look at a situation with FPL where their property is almost valued at $1 billion, the taxes that they pay in its entirety to all the taxing entities is roughly about $20 million, and the city of Riviera Beach receives about $8 million associated with that. Now realize that FPL is also a depreciating asset. It is actually seen as equipment, so the value and the taxes that are paid on an annual basis goes down. So it's not something that, as other properties appreciate, that particular property doesn't go up. And so when we look at your other homes, roughly the median household price in Riviera Beach is roughly about $232,000. And so if we look at the gross value of a property that's about $200,000, you have the $50,000 exemption, and so the net taxable value is $150,000, and their tax bills are roughly about $3,475, with the city of Riviera Beach receiving about $1,200 associated with that. And so your overall tax bill, the portion that funds government, is a lot smaller than a lot of folks think. So that's important to know when you do have to pay your tax bill when that is received. So when we look at the annual taxes that are paid by the city of Riviera Beach, and we're talking holistically, all the properties in the city of Riviera Beach, you're seeing that the city receives about $48 million from the taxes that it assesses. So 37% the city receives, but when you look at the other taxing entities, $42 million, the school board receives $29 million, the county, $4.3 million, the healthcare district, children's services receives $3.8, and South Florida Water Management District $1.6, and then the Florida Inland Navigational District receives roughly about $192,000. But it's important to note that when we look at services that the city provides, but then when we look at services that the school district as well as the county provide, it's important that we make sure we have a seat at the table in those discussions, because the taxpayers of Riviera Beach are paying a large portion to those entities to provide services to our community. So when we look at the taxes that are levied and the services that are provided, there's certainly an opportunity for us to advocate for expenses that help benefit the residents of our community. So this particular slide talks about the composition of the properties that are in Riviera Beach, but also the taxes that are levied. One of the things that is glaring in this particular slide, and we had to point it out, is that of your residential type, your non-homesteaded properties, about 40% of your housing stock is for non-homesteaded properties. That means that properties that this is an investment or a second home for persons. This may not be their primary residence. They may live elsewhere throughout the year. But of those properties that are non-homesteaded properties, 85% of those property owners are not Riviera Beach residents. And so when we have the discussion with the board is how do we move forward with looking to improve the owner occupancy in our community, that's a number that we certainly would like to see go down from the standpoint of we want to make sure that owner-occupied dwellings is something that we look to improve upon. And as we look to make have more discussions with the board, this is something that we want to see investments in.
Go ahead.
I'm sorry. Thank you. Mr. Evans, is that 85%, does that take into account condominiums that are owned by
Yes.
boards? So is there a way to disaggregate out the condominiums and take a look? I mean, I always thought it was around 65 or 70% of the homes were lived in by renters rather than owners.
We can certainly look to try to extract that information. I think we can grab that. but also when you look at the amount of condos versus the sheer mass of properties, it's going to be a small number.
Yeah.
It's not going to be as large as one would anticipate.
I mean, it's still a bad number, but it just, yeah, thank you.
Madam Chairman,
Go ahead.
and Mr. Evans, if you could just clarify that again, because that says 85% of rental properties are not owned by Riviera Beach residents. Is that suggesting that it's owned by folks outside of the zip code? I mean, how do we get that percentage? What's the source?
Want to speak to that?
Yeah. Yeah, this 85%, and Dr. Botel, you know, you're correct. About 73% are rental properties. 85% of that 73% are owned by non-city
Thank you.
zip code residents. So, yes.
Thank you.
So one of the things that, as previously discussed, and we've had conversations with the board, is how do we look to make some investments in owner-occupied dwellings, and how do we improve the owner occupancy in our community? And so as we look to bring that number down, certainly that's going to be a push that you're going to see, a request for some discussions with the board and possibly funding that looks to address some of that and to ensure that we can move to a more stable community and more stable neighborhoods if we go to more owner-occupied dwellings. So that's going to be a push as we move forward. But you can see the composition of our community as it relates to tangible personal property, residential, which is homesteaded. It's only 16% of the entire tax levy are homesteaded residents. And so most of the revenue that are collected are from non-homesteaded property, tangible personal property. So you're getting a lot of income in from your industrial and commercial entities that have equipment. But a lot of some of the conversations that was had at the city manager level is a lot of those entities that have equipment that is tangible property, they are disputing some of those valuations because of the time in which some of their operations were closed during the pandemic. So just to put that into perspective, that's something that we can see that may not impact our community, but as great as it will impact others, but nonetheless, some of those entities are disputing the assessments that have been provided. So this is our unassigned fund balance and percentage of general fund, and I will have Mr. Sherman explain the next two slides.
Yeah, the next two slides I like to show every year because I really think it shows where the city is standing fiscally. This one here, this is our undesignated fund balance as a percentage of our revenues. I know the 39% may look high, but I just want to caution that about 45% of our fund balance is in accounts receivables. So if you're thinking of, you know, approaching an emergency of some sort, our fund balance is really closer to 20% rather than 39%. And if you can see if you read the footnote at the bottom, you know, GFOA says, you know, you should be around, you know, that 16% mark. But keep in mind, if you're in an area where you have natural disasters, you're going to want to be higher. So again, you know, as you can see for South Florida, you know, we're in excellent shape compared to some of our other municipalities here. But again, I do want to point out that 45% of that is in accounts receivables. And then on the next slide, the other one that I always like.
Hold on 1 second.
Oh, sure.
So what accounts receivables that would create such a, I guess,
Primarily, they're, you know, we have trade receivables that, you know, that we have, but that probably only makes up about $3 million. Those are code liens, lot clearing, you know, those types of receivables that we have, health insurance, all those. Most of our receivables on the books in the general fund are actually due from other funds. So, for example, the Marina District owes the general fund about $5 million because we front all of those other projects. So if FEMA owes us a couple $1 million, well, that's a cash that comes out of the general fund, and then we carry the receivable from FEMA. So that's really the big bulk of it is the fact that the general fund is really the bank for the other funds.
Okay, thank you.
And on that same note, the other slide that I really do like to look at is cash on hand. You know, obviously one of the keys is to make sure that we have cash available when the bills come due. The city spends approximately $175,000, $180,000 per day to operate the general fund. So when you look at this 118 days, that pretty much gets you, you know, 3 months, you know, maybe closer to 4 months. So again, that's your emergency cash. So if you think about it, and you think about something like a Katrina, you know, New Orleans loses half its population, nobody's paying their water bills, nobody's coming in for a building permit right away. This is how much cash you really have to be able to operate under the normal operational process. So we have about $3.5 million. So this is a little bit lower than I, you know, would like to see. I wish we were, you know, more towards the right-hand side of this graph. But again, once we start collecting some of those receivables, our fund balance won't change, but then our cash balance will certainly get better. Last year, when we showed this slide, we were at 123 days. So again, we did take a slight hit on that amount. But again, 3+ months, I think we're in good shape on that.
The next slide speaks on the citywide budget, and it's important to note we do get questions in regards to the sheer size and sophistication and complications associated with some of the operational elements that we have in the city. So when you look at all the particular business units and operations the city has in its entirety, it's $189 million. So when you look at the general fund all the way to what we have as the lowest fund, which is parking, the general fund is the largest fund that the city has. That's where your ad valorem or your property tax revenue goes into. Your utility district is paid for by user fees, and so the city of Riviera Beach collects a lot of other revenue streams from user fees, charges for services, grants, all those different other funding sources that help make up the overall city budget. So when we talk about the budget being a spending plan, it's anticipated that well over $100+ million goes into funding local government and the services that we provide. So the next slide breaks down the general fund, and that's the fund that is most commonly discussed and the fund in which your property tax goes into. Roughly about $48.5 million, or 59% of the funding pie, is the general fund. And then you have the list of other charges for services, other taxes, license and permits, shared revenues, and other revenues. So when you look at that slice, that 48.5%, and then we get into the slide that will follow, you will see that most of the property tax revenue, roughly about 78% of the revenue that's collected from property tax, goes to fund just public safety. So the money that is collected, your property tax revenue, funds your public safety departments and leaves a little bit more. But so that's why it's important for us to look for other revenue streams and to make sure that some of the business units are either generating revenue or operating at no deficiency or no deficit. So this is the $89.9 million general fund and what makes up the general fund. And the general fund provides for a lot of flexibility with how you utilize that, where in your enterprise fund, such as the utility district, you have to utilize it for specific business units or purposes associated with that particular operation. So this is the slide that breaks down, if you took a dollar and said, okay, how much of this dollar goes towards funding government? And so you look at $23.4 million to fund our police department, which was roughly about 29%, $15.5 million to fund fire, which is 19%, general government 13.8%, general administration 17%, public works about 5%, and then library, recreation about that 5.9%. So the large bulk of that $81 million is spent to fund public safety departments. And so when we do get into the conversation and discussion in regards to the fire assessment, you're going to see that there is some fixed cost associated with just providing the services and the availability to provide those services, and why it's critical for us to look at alternative revenue streams to help mitigate some of the challenges associated with what can face the general fund in the event of an economic downturn. So just to go back to the previous slide, if you see that 59% of the revenue that the city has collected in to fund the general fund, so if there's any decrease in property values or there's an economic downturn, you start seeing a significant impact in your ability to fund government. At the county level, that's roughly about 70% of their revenue. So as we get a cold, the county may get the flu if there is a downturn in the economy, because we're not as reliant on ad valorem revenue or property taxes than the county is. So we're going to get into the discussion related to the fire assessment and why we're having the conversations about the fire assessment. In previous budget conversations, we discussed that what is ways to continue to provide fire service in the city of Riviera Beach. And when we look at breaking down the cost associated with fire services, roughly about $13 million is hard fixed cost associated with fire services. So you see that $15 million, $15.5 million is the budget for the fire department. 13 million of that is associated with providing fire services exclusively. You'll hear in the presentation that will follow that those fees are the availability fee. So regardless if we respond to one fire or 32 fires, that cost is going to be fixed because we have to have the ability to provide that service. In order to move forward with a fire assessment, you have to go through a process that actually extracts what in your budget is associated with EMS and what is associated with fire services, because you cannot assess for something whereby the property owner is not deriving an actual benefit associated with it. So the fire assessment is in order to look at all the properties in Riviera Beach and what is the availability fee associated with the city of Riviera Beach providing fire service. So you cannot assess for EMS. The other component about the fire services, and in my past experience, when you look to implement a fire assessment also takes away the burden on the general fund and passes that burden on to the assessment, which provides more liquidity on the general fund. So there is things that the board can do as it relates to the millage rate if you replace that revenue stream. In addition to the revenue that's collected can only exclusively go to provide fire services. You cannot utilize it for any other service. So when we get into the property composition in the city of Riviera Beach, you'll see that this breakdown is the entire mixture of the units in Riviera Beach. So when you look at the assessed value, you have parcels that are from 0 all the way to over $100,000, and you'll see that roughly about 16% of the parcels in Riviera Beach pay approximately 0 property tax, and then some others are from that $210 to over that $843 associated with the property taxes. When you look at a fire assessment, there are components that allow for you to provide for relief for those persons that may be on the lower end of the socioeconomic ladder and you wanted to provide some relief for them. You have to pay for that from the general fund to be able to provide that particular relief. There is also situations where you have properties, and in discussions you will exempt certain entities. You may exempt the school district, you may exempt religious institutions and those type, but those are paid for out of legally available funds, which will be the general fund. So any exemption, you do have to pay for that to provide those exemptions, but that's also calculated in a part of the analysis. And so, you know, a lot of folks are going to ask the question, well, why is the city of Riviera Beach looking at possibly implementing a fire assessment where there is certain challenges that we have associated with the fire services? And I'll have Chief Kurd come up to speak in more specificities on some of the challenges associated with fire service. But ultimately, in order to fund the fire stations that we're looking to bring online, the 2 stations, whether it's 88 and 86, and then subsequent improvements to 80, or subsequent reconstruction for 87 and then 89, we know that there has to be a revenue stream associated with that. And so as we look at potential revenue streams, the fire assessment is one thing that we look at. Also, when we look at equipment and apparatus, most of your fire units are now anticipated to be 10 years in primary status and then 10 years in reserve status. We as an agency have done a good job on keeping up with some of the equipment, but as fire services change, as admissions change, as vehicles become more technologically advanced, there is a need to move forward with new apparatus. Also, the monies associated with training and making sure that your folks are properly trained to be able to effectuate fire rescues. One of the challenges in our community here is that you have high rises, you have a port, you have 95, so we're a fairly good sized city, but we have big city assets and challenges when it comes to providing fire services in our community. So like I said, this can be a financing mechanism that can assist in bringing those fire stations online. Also, it's a mechanism that you can do a bond issuance again and pledge that revenue stream associated with it, whether it's for apparatus or new equipment. Like I said earlier, it's a tax equity tool because it brings more payers to the table. In my past experience, after 3 years of having the fire assessment in place, we were able to actually reduce the millage rate because of the dedicated funding stream that was provided to fire services through the fire assessment. So it's hard to make it a balance out, but eventually you could get to that point if that's a strategy going in. If you then provide this dedicated funding stream for fire service, you do have liquidity in the general fund. If you're able to move $2 or $3 million away from the general fund, that's $2 or $3 million that you can look to do some modifications on the millage rate. You could also look to invest in other public safety opportunities. And the other thing about this is discussed annually. So as you go through the budget process, this is not something that it is a ongoing, reoccurring thing. It is something that it's like putting a spigot in the wall, and the board can determine how much to open the spigot and when to turn the spigot off. So it provides you a tool in order to be able to discuss as part of your budget process. And also on the tax equity purposes, one of the things that we see in our tax system here in the state of Florida, especially with property tax, it's an unequitable system because you have 2 property owners that live next door to each other, and if one receives Save Our Homes since 1999 and somebody has moved in since 2008, they're getting the same service and their tax bill may be profoundly different, to the tune of $1,000 or $1,500 different. So the tax system, as it relates to the property tax system, is not an equitable structure. It's the best structure we have in place right now, but the fire assessment looks at establishing a equity tool that allows for you to make sure there's uniformity and consistency, and you can adjust it accordingly. And so we'll get into more specificities as it relates to that. So I will ask for the chief.
Mr. Evans.
Yes, sir.
So before they come, I guess I want to ask some questions on a couple things. And I know we're probably going to get a little further into it, but they're going to speak on the operational necessity side.
Yes, sir.
Okay. So I guess my question is, you kind of alluded to that this was permitted and there are some requirements. Is this something that has been set forth in statute that is permissible? And if you do know, can you share that statute? And also the second part is, what other municipalities is taking advantage of this fire assessment?
So, Madam Chair, if I may.
Go ahead.
That's going to be incorporated in part of the presentation, and I think in the presentation it also cites the actual statute that provides the opportunity to move forward with a special assessment.
Follow up. And we do have, if I'm correct, we already have someone already conducting a fire assessment study, correct?
That is correct, and they're going to share their presentation.
Oh, so it's completed?
Yes, sir.
Oh,
Yep.
okay, thank you.
So if I can have Fire Chief John Curd get into the fire assessment fees and some of the things that need to be addressed as it relates to fire rescue.
Thank you, Mr. Evans. Good evening, Council.
Good evening.
So on the next slide we have here, we're talking about some of the items that are capital needs as it relates to fire service. Again, the fire assessment fee or funding coming from that assessment couldn't be applied towards EMS, but it doesn't negate the fact that we can see some benefits on the fire side. One of my biggest missions, especially considering the fire department is now a charter department, is ensuring that Riviera Beach Fire Rescue can provide the same level and hopefully better levels of service than the municipalities around us. I don't want to belabor the point on the fire stations. You all have heard me talk about the fire stations. We got some good forward momentum on the stations while Station 88 is well on its way. We do know that by the end of the year, Station 87 is going to be on the ground and we're going to be in a temporary station over at the Wells.
Chief, 1 second. I just want to let the record reflect Chairperson Shirley Lanier is on the dais. Thank you.
Good evening. So we will have Station 87 at Wells Recreation Center. It will be a temporary facility. I'm still working with Ms. McBride and working with the Department of Veteran Affairs to determine a long-term resolution for Fire Station 89 on Military Trail. But if we do stay in that station is now 25 years old, is going to need some renovations. And while these stations look new, while our apparatus look new, some of those newer, beautiful red apparatus you see are a result of pride and ownership. Our guys take very good care of them, but what's under the hood is what matters. Many of those vehicles are approaching 10 years old and have over 100,000 miles on them. And while I know we only service 8 square miles, we run a good deal of call volume. So we're starting to see, while we've obtained newer apparatus, we're at that point in time where you have apparatus that go into reserve. And when we talk about these apparatus, we're $300,000-400,000 for an ambulance or a rescue truck, and we're anywhere from $500,000 to $750,000 for some of the engines and aerial apparatuses. Some of the other things that we're going to be needing as we go along is enhancements in some of the equipment that we have. For example, extrication equipment. There's a lot of advancements in technologies on how they construct vehicles. Our extrication equipment's over 10 years old, so we have situations where we can't even cut the steel on some of these vehicles because our equipment isn't up to par, up to standard with some of the new technological advancements, whether it be rolled steel, boron steel. We're starting to encounter more and more of these vehicles, and that's another capital expense that's needed. SCBAs, our self-contained breathing apparatus, those are approaching 7-8 years old. NFPA requires very specific timelines and upgrades, and once you've upgraded a pack 3 times, you can no longer upgrade that air pack. You have to go into the newest, most compliant version. Some of the things that I would say bother me the most as it relates to some of our costs are unfunded mandates. We're seeing unfunded mandates come down from the feds all the time, whether it's requirements from the DOT, NFPA. These are things that are put into place. The cancer reduction bill. This is an unfunded mandate. While you all have supported that, $350,000 was just purchased in bunker gear, but bunker gear has a lifespan. So we're going to be having this conversation every 5 years on the need to upgrade this equipment so that we can keep it to standard. Replacement of extractors, washers, and training. Training is probably one of my biggest initiatives. We're seeing less and less structure fires. So while we used to rely on experience for training, we're now having to create that environment, and trying to do that comes at a cost. Live fire burns aren't what they used to be in the old days, where you could just have a house, set it on fire, acquire that structure, and tell the guys to go put it out. There are so many laws now from the EPA surrounding that many times you have to go to training institutions to get some of this done. And I'm looking to enhance some of our services, special ops, rope rescue, hazardous materials. These are the type of things that we should have and we do need, but they're all going to come at an expense, and they're all going to come up here to be needed. We have now seen the need for community risk reduction. We've seen the need for emergency preparedness and preparation through COVID. We're in hurricane season. I'm looking to build it to make this more robust and make us a better, more efficient fire department, but there's going to be funding that's needed associated with that. And hopefully this will be an option for you all to consider as it relates to funding. All of this information was provided through a strategic plan. And I believe some of you all in this room even participated in our community-driven strategic plan. It was a 5-year plan developed by the Center for Public Safety Excellence. That is the agency that provides accreditation. And one of Mr. Evans's goals laid out to me was he's looking for his fire department, his police department, and many of his other departments to become accredited departments. Accreditation comes at a cost. But this is a community-driven strategic plan, and in this strategic plan, the community has basically called for everything that I have mentioned up here. Some of the community expectations are response times, top-notch training, up-to-date equipment, transparency, having enough employees to meet standards. And we've talked about that about a year and a half ago over at the Marina Event Center, or excuse me, the Clean and Safe building, where we talked about staffing levels, where ISO requires a certain number of personnel on scene for a first alarm. And if you want to go back to revisit that, I'm sure we can make time for that, but I don't want to give you that hour-long presentation again. But this is all available to you all. It's on our website, so if you want to refer to our community-driven strategic plan and what the community said they wanted, it's available to you and the community on our website.
Thank you, Chief. So we get into the next slide that speaks to the consequences associated with not implementing the fire assessment. Obviously, if we cannot collect the revenue associated with moving forward with said initiative, we will not have the cash on hand to move forward with the capital construction of the fire stations. I know that as part of the solicitation document, we looked at a design build finance mechanism, and we're working through the nuances associated with that. And so we'll be able to provide you more information on that when we get to a further point and PFM is done with their particular review. But nonetheless, as it stands right now, based on the information we have and the assets and resources we have, that we do not have the cash on hand to move forward with the construction of the fire station. Without having a dedicated revenue stream, we don't have the capacity to be able to go forward with said construction. So whenever mechanism we utilize, you have to have the funding stream to assist in the payment of the bond, the note. Right now, we're seeing capital construction for fire stations roughly anywhere from $12 to $15 million for fire stations. That number is continuously increasing as the cost for construction looks to go up. So we're moving with a sense of urgency. Now, when this particular assessment, if it's the pleasure of the board to move forward in such a direction, is implemented, that's a policy discussion that the board would have, and when's the opportune moment to look to do that. But in order to move forward in such a direction, we would have to be able to obtain the necessary capital to be able to put together a payment for a bond issuance if we were able to go to the market and get it ourselves. So now the next part of the presentation is Ms. Walkers, who is from GSG, a Government Services Group, that will get into more specificities on the fire assessment and speak on the rational nexus that is required per statute to move forward in such a direction. So at this time, I will turn the presentation over to Ms. Walker.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Okay, Sandy Walker with Government Services Group. Government Services Group was hired by the city through a competitive bid in October. We've been working with your staff to develop this assessment program, and today we're here to present it. So what is a fire assessment? Simple. It's a charge imposed against properties to pay for fire services. You cannot fund EMS through a fire assessment. It is not statutorily driven. It is a home rule revenue source. Non-ad valorems are a home rule revenue source, so they have a higher standard of how people pay. It has to meet certain case law requirements. The case law is, one, it has to benefit property. Taxes do not have to benefit property. You do not have to have people using your schools or in your schools to be able to have to pay for them. The case law says to have a non-ad valorem assessment, you do have to be able to benefit from the properties. That's why you cannot charge EMS, because saving somebody's life in a house, while it's important to the people, it doesn't provide any benefit to that house. Keeping the house from burning to the ground does provide a benefit to that house. So that's the first case law requirements. The second case law requirements is it has to be fairly and reasonably apportioned. And that's what we look at to see what's a fair and reasonable method of apportioning the cost for fire services. Now, what is statutorily driven is the collection method. The collection method that the city is looking at is a tax bill collection method, and that is statutorily driven by 197.3632 Florida statutes. So, kind of touched on them already, Mr. Evans did. What are the purpose and goals of a fire assessment program? First and foremost, to generate revenue. And then it provides diversification. Like Mr. Evans was saying, you don't want to have everything in the general fund. It's very reliant on the taxable values. When the economy tanks, then you lose revenue. Accountability, it's legally restricted, can only be used for fire services, and only for fire protection services, not for EMS. And equity, like Mr. Evans said, sure.
Madam Chair, I want to ask a question. You're going pretty quick.
Oh, I'm sorry, I do talk fast. I'll slow down a little bit.
The collection method is statutorily required.
Correct.
But the fire assessment itself is ran by is governed.
It's your home rule revenue source, so you would have to adopt an ordinance that provides your legislative determinations, and then that would authorize you to impose these.
Okay. And what's the case law? Do you know?
There's a lot of cases out there. There's a lot of case law out there on valid non-ad valorem assessments.
Okay.
So equity, again, there's a lot of patchworks and exemptions that are with the tax base. Save Our Homes and other tax benefits disproportion what people pay. Like Mr. Evans said, you can have two houses that are exactly the same right next to each other, and the taxes that they pay is based on when they purchased the house, not necessarily based on the market value of the house. So the Save Our Homes provides a huge gap between the market value and the taxable value. And fire assessments are more driven on what service, what benefit that the fire services provides to that property. Taxes, again, don't have to provide any services. You pay your school taxes whether you have children in schools or not. So the methodology that we developed is the historical demand methodology. Most court tested and approved, several court cases out there. It's most widely adopted in the state of Florida. The reason it's called the historical demand is because we look at who is historically driving the services of your fire department and apportion the cost based on that. It's based on the initial response, therefore it treats all calls equally, and it has one rate for residential structures regardless of the size. Most recently, the methodology that we've used has been reviewed by the 4th District Court of Appeal in the Desiderio versus Boynton Beach case. That was in 2010. GSG was the expert witness. We did develop the City of Boynton Beach's methodology and fire assessment program, and we were the expert witnesses on that, and the courts upheld their methodology.
Oh, that's nice.
So you're in a tried and true methodology. So what do we do when we start our analysis? We have 4 key components that we look at. We look at your service delivery. You have ALS with transport. What does that tell me? That tells me you have an EMS component, and therefore I have to take steps to remove the EMS cost and the EMS calls, because again, you cannot fund EMS through a valid fire assessment. We also look at your apparatus and your fire flow available, and based on NFPA standards and the apparatus and fire flow that you have available in the city, you can put out a fully engulfed non-residential fire up to 191,400 square feet. So, and that's just using your resources. If there's a larger fire, obviously you're going to get mutual aid coming in, and it's going to, you're going to be able to fight that fire. But we can only, for a valid fire assessment, we can only look at the resources that you have. We don't look at the resources that are going to be coming from other communities. So you have a 191,400 square feet cap on your non-residential buildings. You only have 7 buildings in the city that exceed that cap. 2 of them are the VA hospital and the parking garage. 1 of them is a school board, and then 4 of them are industrial warehouse. The second component, we look at your fire department budget, and we split out the costs between EMS and fire, and then we develop a 5-year pro forma budget. We do that so that you can have a 5-year average rate and not have to keep going up and down and fluctuating, so it makes it even out. The third component is development of the cost apportionment. So we look at your calls, and we see what that historical demand has been in the past and who's driving the demand for your fire services, and then apportion the cost that way. The fourth component is we look at all the parcels in your city specifically, and we use the ad valorem tax roll and supplement it with field work as necessary. And we look and see how many buildings there are, how many dwelling units there are, what the building uses are, and how much square footage there is. So the 5-year assessable budget, again, we took your adopted fiscal year 2021 budget and your proposed 2022 budget. We removed the EMS cost. We applied annual increases to get to 5 years based on your budgeting practices in the city. And we included your capital CIP program. So we took the expenditures minus the revenue to equal your net expenditures. Then for your net expenditures, we add the miscellaneous assessment expenditures. When you collect it on the tax bill, there are certain benefits that collecting it on the tax bill, but there are also costs. Anything that goes on the tax bill is entitled to the statutory discount, just like when you pay your taxes, your property taxes. So if you pay them all in November, you get a 4% discount on both your taxes and your non-ad valorem. So what we have to do is we have to add those to it. So we add a 4% plus a 1% for under collection, which is a statutory how you budget at 95%. Then you have to send first-class notices to every individual property owner, so it's not a sneak attack that you're going to do this and slip it on there. Everybody's going to know about it, and that is part of the statutory driven.
Madam Chair,
Yes, go ahead.
I'm sorry, you're going very fast.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Some of these are new terms for me, so help me understand.
Sure.
1% under collection.
Yeah, when you do your budgeting, you never budget at 100% of the revenue that you're going to get. It's just a budgeting practice that you use 95%, and so we added that. We used 95%.
Okay, and then you account for the 4% discount. Is that for the non-ad valorem as well?
Yes. Anytime anything goes on the tax bill, if you pay your taxes in November, you get a 4% discount. And you get it for ad valorem and non-ad valorem. So we accounted for that here. So also the tax collector and the property appraiser can charge you a fee for doing the work for you. And so we added those costs in there. So then we get your net assessable expenditures. So just so you understand, out of your entire fire budget, you can fund about 54.85% of your entire fire department budget through the fire services, fire assessment. It's in the fire protection bucket. And you might say, well, wait, we run a lot more EMS calls than we do fire calls. But as the chief and Mr. Evans said, it costs more to provide fire protection than it does to provide EMS.
Madam Chair.
Yes, go ahead.
So again, Ms. Walker, please forgive me, but
No, you're fine.
You say you can operate 54% of your fire services through this assessment?
Correct.
Okay.
Right. And like I said, because it costs more to provide fire protection services, you have to have 2 in, 2 out. Your apparatus are a lot more expensive. You have to have more personnel. EMS, you put 2 people on an ambulance and you run the call. It doesn't cost as much. So the courts have recognized this. In this methodology that we did to develop which portion is fire versus which portion is EMS was the same methodology that was used in the Boynton Beach Fire Department accessible budget, and the courts reviewed it and upheld it. So it's the same methodology.
Madam Chair?
Yes, go ahead.
Thank you. Ms. Walker, thank you so far for the presentation. Just a quick question about the 13.9. That's the average accessible expenditure over that 5-year period, or is that?
Correct. That's the average one year, every year, that's the 5-year average.
So every year, we have up to 13.9 that we can use from the fire assessment to go towards expenditures?
Correct.
Gotcha.
And I'll show you the rates at that $13.9 million, but then I'll show you other rates too.
Okay.
So the cost apportionment, and this is the key to your fair and reasonable apportionment. We looked at 2 years of call data. We looked at the 2019 and 2020 calendar year call data to see who's demanding the services on your fire department. Again, we took out the EMS calls, and we only looked at the fire type calls. And the courts have said fire equals anything up to the level of first responder. So it doesn't necessarily have to be flames, but it's anything up to the level of first responder. So out of the calls that we looked at for the 2 year, there was 765 calls went to single family, or 36.45% of those calls. So 36.45% of that $13.9 million budget gets funded from the single family. Multifamily, 26.11% gets funded of that $13.9 million, or whatever budget you decide to fund. You don't have to fund 13.9, you could fund $1 million, but it still gets broken down into these costs.
Madam Chair.
Yes, go ahead.
Thank you. Could you define multifamily?
Multifamily is your condos, apartments, things like that. Single family is your single family and mobile homes. So institutional is 10.86% of your calls. Now institutional are things that you would think of that are for public good, government, schools, not-for-profits, things like that. Things that are churches, things that are for public purposes. Industrial warehouse is 13.1%. And commercial is 13.48%. So again, this is very key. So whether you fund $13.9 million or $1 million, that budget needs to be divided in this proportion, this pie. It needs to be cut up in these pieces in order to keep you legally defensible. Can't say, well, let's do 50% for single family and only 10% for multifamily, because you wouldn't be proportionate.
Let me ask you a question. Some areas, I know you talked about discounts for early payment, but some areas offer like hardship assistance fees. How does that fit into what we can do for our residents here in the city?
And one of the last slides is going to be other options and policy direction. And I'll explain to you, you have an option, like Mr. Evans said, that you can offer a hardship exemption to those people who truly can't afford to pay the fire assessment. So there is that option that you guys could do. So then the parcel apportionment. So now that we know how the budget needs to be divided, we need to determine, well, what's a fair way, what kind of fair units should we use to calculate the rates? So residential, whether it be single family or multifamily, it's going to be on a per dwelling unit basis. And non-residential, there's 3 categories: commercial, industrial warehouse, and institutional. And it's going to be based on a square footage basis, again, capped per building at the 191,400 square feet. So now that we have all the components, then it's a matter of math. So your single family is 36.45% of your calls. Therefore, they fund 36.45% of your budget, or $5 million. divided by the number of single-family units, 9,697, to get the per unit rate, or $525 per dwelling unit. Multifamily, 26.11% of your budget, or $3.6 million, divided by the 7,457 multifamily units to get a $489 per dwelling unit rate. Your commercial, 13.48% of your budget, or $1.9 million, divided by your 2,631,000 square feet to get a 72 cents per square foot rate. Your industrial warehouse, 13.1% of your budget, or $1.8 million, divided by your 8,767,000 square feet to get a 21 cent per square foot rate. And institutional, 10.86% of your budget, or $1.5 million, divided by your 1,996,000 units to get a 76 cents per square foot rate. Again, I don't think staff is going to recommend you coming out the box and sending everybody a $525 bill. So I've given you some additional rate scenarios. It's always easy for everybody to understand the dwelling unit rate, so I tend to focus on that because commercial, industrial warehouse, and institutional have a lot of varying different sizes, and so based on their size, their charge would be different. But if you were to go at a 33.25% rate of your budget, it would be $175 for single family, $163 for multifamily, and it would generate $4,635,000. Now here's some of your exemptions that I'll explain to you. We've given you the impacts. Like Mr. Evans says, you can exempt government. Government, there is an issue with collecting. They do not get a tax bill, so you cannot lien their property. You can charge them, but the only way you can enforce it is to sue them if they choose not to pay. So typically we recommend not charging government, or if you do charge government, you send them a separate bill and just not pursue collection. So the impact, if you were to go this route for government exemption, you would have to buy it down with the general fund money, is $549,000. The other policy direction that you would make is, do you want to charge your churches and other nonprofits that fall in the institutional category? This exemption is a two-prong exemption. So what it says is that the building has to be wholly tax exempt. So it's providing a public purpose, and it has to be of institutional use. So while you may have the church.
Madam Chair.
Yes, go ahead.
Can you repeat that and state the source of, is that the case law?
It's case law. It's case law.
I've already downloaded it, but here's why I want to say that, and I don't want to get off subject. We got nonprofits running whole entire businesses, and they should not.
Correct.
If they're doing that.
And this is what I was going to say. So it's a two-pronged test for this non-ad valorem assessment, should you choose to make that policy decision and not charge it, because there's a lot of people that don't want to charge churches because they do provide a good benefit for the public. They provide food pantries and shelters and things like that. So what it has to meet a two-pronged test. It has to be wholly tax exempt, and it has to be of institutional use. So the pastor's house, even though it's owned by the church and pays absolutely no taxes, that's a residential use, and it would be charged. Some thrift stores and things like that, or there's other, if it's a commercial business, it would be a commercial use, therefore it would not be exempt. So it's a two-pronged test that they would have to meet, and once they met that, if you made that policy decision to exempt institutional tax exempt, then they would be exempt. The impact for your city at this 35% rate would be $94,000. So you have a lot more government in your city than you do institutional tax exempt, and that's because of that two-pronged test. So then that would net you, if you did make that policy decision to provide the government exemption and the institutional tax exemption, that would net you just about $4 million.
Yes, go ahead.
Yes. You're basing the ratio of government versus, I guess, nonprofits on what? Square footage or the actual assemblies? Like, is it?
The square footage in your city. We look at all the parcels in your city, and we look at all the buildings, because we're not going to charge vacant land, and we look at how many square feet are associated with each building, or how many dwelling units are associated with each building, and based on your actual square footage and your uses and your ownership, there's almost 5 times more government than there are probably schools and things as why, in city buildings and things.
Okay, well, Madam Chair,
Yes, go ahead.
the reason I want to say this, and I think we can probably revisit it later, but, you know, for the longest, Stony Brooks was considered nonprofit. So you don't want to potentially have a couple hundred multifamily property that's on the books as a nonprofit to take advantage of this when they're solely operating under nonprofit.
Is it a housing authority?
No, it wasn't. But they've now converted to, they're not in a nonprofit.
Okay.
Again. So I just don't want.
It still wouldn't fall under that because, like you said, it's apartments, and that would be a residential use, so it wouldn't meet that two-prong test.
Okay.
So that would not have fallen under it. The only exception would be if it's a government housing authority, it would fall under government, and there's no restriction of use. It's just government. So that's why I was asking if that's what it was.
Okay.
So anyways, but I think what staff is going to try and get me to focus on and get you to focus on is the 25% rates, and that would be the $132 per single-family dwelling unit, $123 for the multifamily dwelling unit, 18 cents a square foot for commercial, 6 cents a square foot for industrial warehouse, 19 cents a square foot for institutional, and that would net you about $3 million if you did decide to make that policy decision to do those exemptions. And then again, after you have your statutory discount and you pay your tax collector and your property appraiser, you would probably realize about $2.8 million, which would help you to get in the direction that you want to go with some of the, you could pledge it for debt to help with your stations, your apparatus replacement, and things like that. So these are just different scenarios that you can look at, but I think that's what staff is going to want you to focus on. Then everybody wants to know what their neighbors are doing, so we wanted to tell you, and I've done the comparison at that 25% for the city, the $132 for single family. So West Palm Beach has had an assessment program in place since 2008. I helped them to implement it. Mr. Sherman was there with me, and they started very low. They started at $25. They got it implemented in 2008 when nobody was doing anything, then when the market tanked. And they've been consistent, but then they've increased it over the last few years. So they're charging $100 per dwelling unit, and they're netting about $8.3 million. Boynton Beach is charging $120 per dwelling unit. Again, theirs has been in place since, I want to say 2000. And it's netting about $7.1 million. I believe they're considering going higher this year, but I don't know. We do work with Boynton Beach too.
Madam Chair,
Yes, go ahead.
why is it that all of these other municipalities have the same rate for single-family and multifamily?
You know, some of them, see, it depends on their demand. You had a demand that recognized that there's a difference in the call volume and the rates for single family versus multifamily. Some of them don't. So some of them we don't create that extra category. Some of them we create a nursing home category, which we have not created for you because you don't have a nursing home problem. So we've included the nursing homes in the institutional category. So every fire assessment study is unique to that particular city or county, so that we look at it individually as to where their demand is and what their needs are. So Margate in Broward, they're at $300 for single family, and they net about $9.4 million. Margate, we work with all of these cities on their fire assessment and have for years. Margate is going to 350 this year. It's not official yet, so, but last year it was 300. These are all last year's rates. Pembroke Pines is at $312.32, and they net about $27.4 million. Miramar, $398.23, and they net about $22 million. Deerfield Beach, $235, net about $15 million. Hollywood, $285, nets $32 million. Oakland Park, $199, nets $5.9 million. And North Lauderdale is, see, now this is where the difference is. North Lauderdale has a huge demand from their multifamily and not as many units to divide that budget into it. So their single family is 233 and their multifamily is 396. And they net about $5.2 million. So each program is unique. So that's why it's case law driven and what we have to look at and the analysis that we have to do. So again, policy direction.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Sure.
I just had a question regarding Deerfield, Hollywood, and Oakland Park and North.
Oh, the
Lauderdale.
non-residential?
Yeah,
Okay.
for commercial, yeah, the rest of those. Why are they like that?
Okay, so what happened in Broward County when we first started doing these, and this was in the mid-1990s, the property appraisers' data wasn't specific to the square footage, the actual square footage, because, okay, we use the property appraisers' data to develop the non-ad valorem assessment because it's going on the tax bill and it needs to merge seamlessly with the tax bill information. But it's not 100% perfect for what we do. It's 100% perfect for what the property appraisers do. The property appraisers use that data to place a value on the property. We use it to determine the value of the service that they receive from fire services. So at that time, we were developing tiers. So we had non-residential tiers. So if you're between, 100 and 1,999 square feet, you get this charge. And so that's why you'll see those tiered rates. So policy direction. Proceed with implementation. Is this something that you like, you want to pursue, you want to look at implementing it? If you do, what rates would you want to start off with? Whatever rates you start off with, it's sort of like your millage. You would adopt 2 resolutions, and when you set your millage, you set it at the higher. You can come down from there, but you can't go up when you make the final decision. Assessments are same way, because everybody gets a first-class notice, and they get an individual notice that goes to them and says, the City of Riviera Beach is considering imposing a fire assessment. Based on the information that we have, your property has X amount of dwelling units, and therefore, based on what the city is considering, it will cost you this much. There's going to be a public hearing on the matter, and you're welcome to come and give your input, and here's how you do it. And this is when that public hearing is going to be. So then when you come back for the public hearing, you would make that final decision. So you would say either if you went with the $132, we like the $132, we're going to stick with the $132. Or you could go down from there. But you couldn't say, you know what, we've had an adjustment in our budget, we need more money, so let's go to 150. You could not do that because everybody wasn't properly noticed. So we would need direction on what rates you want to implement and exemption policies. Again, we've talked about the government and how there's a collection problem with government. But you can use in-kind services. So, you can, we've seen people that said, hey, look, a school board, you're costing us this much in fire, so let us use some of your facilities to do some training or things like that. So you can negotiate in-kind services with them. And then institutional tax exempt, I think we've kind of talked about that. It's a 2-pronged test. They would have to meet. Then the hardship exemption, it's not on here, but the hardship exemption is, again, a 2-pronged test. So it would say if somebody has a house that's homesteaded or eligible for homestead, and they are at a certain income level, and it would be set by policy decisions set by you, then we will pay it on their behalf. And here's the thought process behind it. It's going on the tax bill. If somebody truly cannot afford to pay it, it's just like other taxes. There could be a tax deed sold, and eventually they would lose the deed to their house. So if somebody owns a house and truly can't afford to, you could make the decision that we'll go ahead and pay it on their behalf, and you'd set that income level for them. So that would provide that extra level of benefit that, you know, you're good people and you're not trying to evict people, you're just trying to generate revenue to pay for your fire services. The other is the schedule and any other information that I can give you, any other questions that I haven't addressed. I'll be happy to answer them. Sorry.
Madam Chair.
Yes, go ahead.
So have you been, Ms. Walker, have you been a part of setting forth the application process for those hardships?
We've helped design it, but typically, the county, do you have other exemptions? Do you have a water exemption or some other department that looks at those regularly, like for housing or anything like that, where you have other programs? A lot of our clients have other programs in which they have, and they just have that same person or entity that does that analysis.
I want to say we do, I think, Mr. Sherman, right? We do have some other programs that we offer exemptions for.
We have the utility assistance program, yes.
Yeah.
So whoever does that would probably be the best qualified to determine if they would also qualify for this exemption. But again, it's a two-pronged. They have to own the house, and I'm sure your utility probably just has to be a utility user.
Follow up.
Go ahead.
And just so I'm clear, so at the proposed, and I guess this is just for examples purposes, because this isn't technically proposed yet, but
Right.
the 132 that you have for the single-family residence, 123 for multifamily, is that correct?
Correct, it is.
That is what's going to be able to help support us obtaining 54% of operations of our,
No, this is funding at a 25% of that $13.9 million.
oh, 25.
Yeah, the 100% rate is $525 for single family and $489 for multifamily. So this only funds, this helps you get started with getting that fire station, getting some apparatus replacement going, and generating about $2.8 million to help with that. But it doesn't get you to the $13.9 million. Doesn't fully fund it.
Okay, thank you, Madam Chair.
Madam Chair?
Thank you. Yes, go ahead.
Thank you. Ms. Walker, thank you
You're
for
welcome.
the presentation, and thank you for the study that you brought to us.
You're welcome.
Have you taken a look at the average median income of some of the surrounding municipalities that you've done these fire studies for?
No, because we don't look at the income. We look at the fair. It doesn't matter how much income you have. If you call the fire department, you're getting the same service. They're not going to say, "Are you low income?" Okay, well, you're going to get the low income response. They send the same response. So we don't necessarily do that analysis.
Well, no, I
Yeah, I know.
understand that. I understand that it's not going to change the services provided. It was just a question to see if you've actually looked at it
No.
based upon the other municipalities.
We sometimes will look at the property values, but Mr. Evans has done that in this case.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and then the follow-up question, I believe, is actually going to be for Chief Kurt in reference to a few of these assessments.
You have a question?
Yes, Madam Chair.
Okay.
Chief Kurt, of the 11 items that you've outlined that we would need to actually apply these assessments to, do you have an estimated budget on what these total cost would be for all 11 items?
No, we haven't priced out those items. The market's quickly changing. We have looked at some things, and what we looked at 6 months ago isn't what the price is now. But those are things that would be needed over time. Those aren't all immediate needs. That's just what I see coming down the pipeline and, you know, trying to stay one step ahead of what we need before we actually need it.
Okay. And then there was also, apologize, actually, Ms. Walker, one more question. The time frame on the fire assessment. Our city manager referenced that we could use this as a water spigot to where we could turn it on and off.
Correct.
Have any of the municipalities that you worked with actually turned off the assessment since they started it?
There was one, but actually they turned it off before it ever got started. They voted to implement it and then pulled the plug on it before it actually was implemented. But there are some that go down, and I can't think of them now, but I know there are some. But typically, once you get it in place, you have that consistent revenue stream, and you kind of offset it with the millage, or you have more general fund money to do other things that have been put aside for a while. So typically, that's what we see. It is an annual decision. This is statutorily because it goes on the tax bill, so annually you have to re-review it. And you have to adopt new rates each year. So you would go through that same process each year as to what rates you want to set for that year. And you'd go through that same two-step process. You adopt the preliminary rates, send notices out to people. If you've increased the rates, everybody would get another notice. Then you would come back to the public hearing and then adopt the final rates.
Okay. Because once we set this assessment, realistically, I don't foresee, with this additional revenue and with the cost of products going up and going pretty much through the roof, we're going to constantly need this assessment to help cover cost. It's going to be a budgeted item, so I don't see us turning it on and off.
Correct.
Similar to some of these other municipalities. So I want us to make sure that we set the rate at something that's going to be effective for the actual department to operate, and also something that we foresee is going to be in the long term, something that could be here over the next 10 years, because some of the organizations you said started back in 2008 and even sooner than that.
Oh, there's a lot of the Broward cities started in the 90s.
Right.
And I tell you what, they were very grateful that they had this revenue stream when 2008 and the market hit. And a lot of them went to 100% rates at that time because everybody was dying.
Right. So I guess back to the question about the median income, the concern I have looking at some of these municipalities outlined, the median income average is probably about 2.5 times higher than what we're actually here in our city, based upon these 8 different municipalities.
And the reason I gave you those is they were readily available to me because I work with them.
Right.
So I had them readily available. That's the reason I gave them to you.
So even though the service is going to remain the same, the cost and the revenue that our residents actually make on an annual basis is not comparable to these. So trying to charge our residents the same price that we may be charging in West Palm or Boynton, when their median income is much less. That's why that was a question that I would love for staff to look into, to kind of get an idea so that we can set the correct value of the assessed amount. But I appreciate it, though, Ms.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much.
Anybody else?
No, I said thank you so much for your
Thank you.
presentation. Are there any questions for this presenter? Move on.
So, Madam Chair and members of the board, staff is seeking direction as how the board would like to proceed. It's not something that is a decision that the board needs to make today. However, there is a point in the future, especially as we go through the budget process and then look to especially next year when we're anticipating moving forward with the reopening or the opening of a new station. There needs to be that revenue stream in place. So we do have the flexibility to a degree to have further discussions with the board. If this is something that the board has the appetite to look for as part of the next budget process, or especially in light of us moving forward with the fire station, because that revenue stream, one way or another, needs to be put in place. One of the other components that I think is germane to the discussion, that in the event that the board moves forward with the fire assessment and you pledge some of that revenue towards the debt issuance to pay for the fire stations, the remaining capital that you would have on hand, you can go out for another debt issuance of roughly about $25 million to address some infrastructure issues as it relates to the roadways in our community. You will be having a pavement management study that will be coming back before the board that will speak to the conditions of the roadway in the community and actually grading the conditions of the roadways so we can make a plan that is consistent with what industry standards to go ahead and address some of the roadway infrastructure in our community. So there is that opportunity, and then obviously as we're watching what's happening on the federal level, some additional funding that may come down to look to reinvest in infrastructure. So something for the board to have some conversation, but staff does need some direction from the board. That is this a mechanism that the board supports staff moving forward and having subsequent discussions and looking to run this concurrently with when the money is going to be needed to pay for the stations? Or does the board want to look to move forward with this at the current time? In the event that we wanted to move forward now, it is a very quick, very aggressive timeline that would have to be laid out to be able to move forward. And so just having some discussions with staff and basically all the process, and since this is new, it is something that staff would probably recommend to the board to defer this discussion until we get further along with the stations and we identify which mechanism we utilize, whether it's the financing element or whether we go get the money to help build the stations. So that can run concurrently, and then that would be something that could possibly come into place next year. But we do need some direction and perspective from the board as to how you wish to proceed as it relates to that. One other component I did want to mention that, I've done a fire assessment before in a previous community where in Haines City, where the median income was about the same as Riviera Beach, maybe even lower. And when we started at 144,983 for property values. So every property paid 144.93, and then 85 cents per 1,000 square feet up to a certain threshold. So this is something that other communities that have similar demographics as our communities have implemented to effectively address some of the challenges associated with funding fire service. We also went through a bond validation hearing that actually we filed a lawsuit against ourselves to ensure that our process that we followed was fair and equitable, and there was a derived benefit for property owners. And with that validation from the court, we then knew that if anyone filed a lawsuit against us, that we've already had a decision from a judge. And so we utilized that particular funding stream to buy new apparatus and to construct a new station. So it is very common to utilize it for a lot of capital assets for fire services. So at this particular moment, staff is prepared to receive direction from the board as to how you wish to proceed.
Madam Chair?
Yes, you had a question, Ms. Patel?
No.
Oh, okay, go ahead, sir.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Evans or Mr. Sherman, how much additional bonding would we be able to levy with the additional 2 to 3 million revenue of fire assessment?
You want me to take that?
Yeah.
Sure. Okay, so what we're looking at for the fire stations is between $25 and $30 million, which would cover 86 and 88. That'll take about half of that 25%, so the total is coming down about 2.9 million. So that'll eat up about half of that. If you take the other half of that revenue and you're putting it into current operations, that then would free up again another $1.4 million, $1.5 million, which we could turn into again $25 to $30 million for street projects or parks or something else. Or again, the other issue is where you hold that back and now you use it for 87 and 89. It could cover again a good portion of those. So in total, we're probably talking $55–60 million if you used every cent for debt service. It would just depend on how you wanted to split that up between a general fund component and a fire station component.
Okay. And if we use a follow-up, Madam Chair?
Yes, go ahead.
Thank you. So if we use those towards our debt services, replacement of the fire stations, we can assess, but some of the apparatus, some of the training, and some of the funding that we need for bunker gear, we're not going to have that availability because we're going to be applying most of it to the fire stations? Okay. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Yes, any other questions? So, Mr. Evans, are you looking for us to make a decision in regards to moving forward with this fire assessment or not?
Staff is requesting direction if the board wants to look to bring this back as one of the points of discussion when we bring you the funding mechanisms to move forward with the capital construction of the fire stations. If the board wanted to move quicker, you can look to implement that as part of this budget process, but at the recommendation of staff, we're recommending that this come back to discuss with the board when we are prepared to provide the financing mechanism so it runs concurrently, and that gives us some time to have some community conversations and discussions with regard to this particular item, and then be able to articulate to the community and show the community the intent behind the fire assessment and why it's critical to move forward with the construction of the stations in the community.
Madam Chair,
Yes, go ahead.
I would be in favor of the option that you just mentioned, where we would get the information from the community and provide education to them for it, because I know in the past we've had many attempted discussions about the fire assessment, and a lot of times the education piece doesn't really make it to the people. So I think that would be needed, because I don't want to have a discussion about moving forward and then all of a sudden you have people that are out there that are putting the absolute opposite of what the intent is behind it. So I would like to see that option where we provide education, but I am in support of it.
Yes,
Hey, Madam Chair, I agree. I think it's critically important that we provide for time to have community input, so I would agree that we would wait until the time you suggested.
Madam Chair?
yes, go ahead.
I would also recommend or add to that. I agree with my colleagues, but I'm adding a component where we start maybe at a $50 to $75 model with a gradual increase. So there's not as high impact on the residents immediately in the first year, but then possibly looking at a 5 to 10 year span where we increase it to a certain number, maybe getting to that 132. So if we could possibly present it to the residents and then look at a gradual increase over time, giving them that option as well.
Madam
Yes, go
Chair,
ahead.
could you just repeat what she said about not being allowed to increase it?
Madam Chair, if I may.
Yes, go ahead.
Once you do provide notice, similar to that of the trim notice, you cannot go, you set a maximum and then you can't go below it. So as we go through, if it's the board's desire to go through the process, we can establish the maximum, but the board has the flexibility to decrease it as part of the hearing process.
To decrease it?
At the subsequent, yeah, but the subsequent year, you can change it. You change it every year. You can you discuss it every year.
Okay.
But not within that year.
Right.
Right, go ahead, Mr. McCoy.
So, thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Evans, yeah, I don't have any concerns with us providing public input, but I think you proffered the scenario of us incorporating it into the discussions of how we potentially finance the fire stations, which is something that we're basically going to do now, which I would much rather prefer, because even if the fire stations were not considered, even if we had decided as a board to go to, seeking or putting out bonds, the mere fact that we have now solidified the fire department as a charter department makes that department more reliant on us to support it financially. So irrespective of whether or not we use the dollars or the proceeds that come from it, we still have an obligation to fully fund our fire department. And, I, for the same reasons, want to support public input, but I want to know, I guess I want to make sure that we're reminded that we still have an obligation, because they're a chartered department, that, if those hard costs that was $13 million exist, we still have to continue to figure out how to work that into the general fund. And quite frankly, I don't see, for me, why would we attempt to delay the inevitable only for the reasons of making sure that the public has an understanding of it. So I'm certainly okay with it, and I'd be the last to support a tax hike or tax increase or special assessment, but this is something, whether we can probably agree with this theory or not, that we have to, this is a mandate by the voters that we have to support our own fire department, and that's my perspective. And I would much rather have this conversation simultaneously, because even if we decide to choose a different financing mechanism, I think we still have the obligation to support the fire department. And, obviously, that's where I think we should be.
So that's your orders? You can move forward, but I think that the most important part here is this. When we talk about fire assessments, we have these words that we're talking about fees, and we're talking about how it's calculated, and we're talking about what's going to happen with it. Those are the things that the public needs to know. What is a fire assessment? How does it work? What does this do for your bill? How does this work for you as a resident? How does this work for you as a business? And I think just the basic definitions of these terms and what it means is something that the public needs to know, because as Commissioner Miller Anderson stated, people will make what it is seem what it's not. So we want to make sure that the basics of what a fire assessment is, the basics of how it's calculated, and make this information available to the public in a public forum to get feedback from the residents. And I'm sure that they will be even more so grateful, because we are starting from the standpoint of just the basics and providing information to the public, and then moving forward, as we're moving forward with this process, moving forward with the public, with their input and their knowledge of what we're actually trying to accomplish here. So yes, we can move forward.
Yes, Madam Chair, staff will bring this to the community and have discussions as quickly as possible, and making sure that there's adequate notice to the community, and then ultimately bring this item back for subsequent discussions, especially as we move through how do we move forward with funding the fire department and the fire stations. And certainly, I can tell you from past experience, this is not something that any city manager wants to propose, but in order for us to address some of the challenges that we have with regards to the condition of some of our facilities and the intent to move forward as quickly as this board wants to move forward with bringing facilities of the 21st century out of the ground, it's imperative that we look to move forward with providing the necessary resources so this charter department can continue to provide the services that it needs to provide in this community. And so we believe that we can articulate the rationale behind it, as well as the intent behind this, as well as having fire personnel involved in the conversations and discussions that know that this revenue stream goes exclusively to the fire department. It cannot be utilized in any other form or fashion. So making sure we get that out to the community. And so we will have a series of community meetings and then bring information back as part of the discussions when we look at what are the financing options for fire stations in the city of Riviera Beach. So, Madam Chair, as we move into the second element associated with this particular presentation, we're going to talk about our utility revenue sufficiency study. And at this time, I'm going to turn the presentation over to Mr. Randy Sherman.
Okay. Thank you very much. And I do have Ryan Smith, who is the rate consultant, is on the line, and he will be making the actual presentation. But before we get into that, as you know, the rate covers both the operations of the utility district and the capital needs of the district. And wanted to kind of put the board on alert here that, you know, we're starting to get to some critical parts of the financial operations that are not looking favorable for the district at this time. On the operation side, we're starting to see a drawdown on the cash balances. Now, as you know, we have not done a rate increase for a couple of years. And if we go back and we look at 2017, operationally, they had $36.6 million. And right now they're at $24.2 million. So the cash is starting to draw down. Now again, keep in mind that whenever we do a billing, right out of the chute, about 25% of the customers are delinquent. Okay? At the end of the day, 5 to 7% are really uncollectibles. Okay, so while we budget revenues that equal our expenditures, we're maybe spending 100% of the expenditures, but we're not collecting 100% of the revenues. So we're starting to see a drawdown on cash, which obviously is not favorable to the district. For 2021, we're seeing our operating revenues are about $900,000 less than they were last year, which is, again, a negative sign. So we're not keeping pace even with last year's budget as far as the revenues. And the 2021 budget, again, is a couple of $1 million more than the 2020 budget was. So again, going through the month of May, our revenues are not really tracking very well. Keep in mind, when we built the 2021 budget, it included a 6% rate increase that was never implemented. At the end of May right now, the district is actually running a deficit of about $3.4 million. We've had discussions internally. We think by the end of September, we'll be able to get that balanced. Part of the reason for the $3.4 million is there are a lot of upfront payments that not only the district makes, but the city makes. So upfront, their debt payments are due in October. So on October 1st, they see a huge cash outlay. Pension payments are due in October. There's a lot of things that happen early on in the year. So running the deficit isn't unusual, but last year at this point, the deficit was about $2.1 million. This year, we're at $3.4 million.
Yes.
You spoke of pension payments. That wouldn't be relevant to this fund, though, right?
I'm sorry?
You mentioned pension payments. That wouldn't be relevant to this fund.
Yes. Every fund that has employees makes a portion, pays for their employees' pension plans. So now I'm talking about the old pension plans where we make a lump sum payment at the beginning of the year. FRS, we actually pay on a payroll by payroll basis. But the old pension plans, we make one payment a year.
Okay, and that's factored in the employees that's rented from the city that USD pays the pension?
Correct.
Okay.
Correct, yes.
Thank you.
The district is currently operating with 13 vacancies. That obviously is helping us, deal with that deficit. That'll work out over time, but that's not optimal to be running with that many vacancies. And as we start the 2022 process, and we've done our salary projections and benefit projections and the like. Right now, we're looking at about a $2.5 million funding deficit as we get into the early phases of looking at the operational budget. On the capital side, again, the fees do pay for the capital. I think staff has been pretty open about the conditions that are there. They've made presentations in February, April, and the last council meeting on June 2nd about the conditions and the dire need for some capital improvements over there. The 2021-2025 capital budget does have $155.9 million of capital spending requirements. That did include $121 million for the new water treatment facility. Looking at the debt service, again, doesn't necessarily depend on how it's financed, but the cheapest method, we're looking at a rate increase of 26% would be required just to pay the debt service on the new water treatment facility. Again, that's not today, it could be, 3 years out, but we either can do that lump sum 3 years out, or we can, build up to that process. The district does have an A+ rating at this time, but it kind of is in jeopardy. If we turn 2021 with an operating deficit, that's not obviously going to look favorable for the credit rating. Another concern is our coverage calculations have been decreasing over time. And let me kind of explain what the coverage calculation is. We are required by our bond documents that when we take all of our revenues and subtract out just the operational costs of running the district, we should have 1.2 times our debt service remaining. That way, again, as the bondholders know that we're budgeting that they are going to get paid, because the debt service gets paid after operations get paid. So as you can see, in 2018, that coverage was 2.15 times. 2019 is 1.87 times. In 2020, it dropped to 1.52 times. Again, our bottom line is 1.2, but as you can see, we've had this negative trend over the last 3 years. And again, we're concerned with 2021 if we don't see some bounce back and possibly, again, at least get back to a break-even point for 2021. The goal, again, is to get that new water treatment facility up and running in 3 years. But as you know, whether you go for a mortgage or you just go to rent an apartment, they want to know where that revenue is coming from, to pay that back. It would really be, we just don't have the financial capacity in our current rates to go out and get any financing for the new facility. So we have to look at adopting the supporting rates before we can proceed in that vein. So again, as we did with the fire, there's a consequence to not having those rates in place. Our goal obviously is to bring back the absolute least expensive financing, whatever method that is. We know we have some money coming from the federal government, which will certainly help. We can't necessarily rely on the infrastructure bill, but hopefully, there may be even more assistance coming. But in order to even enter into an agreement for anybody to move forward on a new plant, we would have to have, the financing in place. What I will say, too, is should the district go out and borrow funds to build a new plant and grants come down the line, there'd be two options for the district to decide on what it would do with those bond proceeds. You could either move them into other critical infrastructure projects, or you could actually use the bond proceeds to pay back the debt. So there isn't necessarily a risk of having the money, because again, there's always other projects, but if there aren't, we could actually use it to just pay the debt service back and take the bonds out early and save some interest costs. So that's the lead-in to the presentation from Ryan Smith. And hopefully Ryan is on the line. And Ryan, whoops, before I get to that, I'm sorry. We did want to point out the last bond sale that we did was $40 million. And as you can see, we have spent just north of $20 million. We still have about $20 million, actually a little bit more than $20 million in the bank and the bond funds due to investing. That number tends to grow a little bit more than the initial sale. But, staff continues to work to get these projects done. I've seen the agenda for the 23rd. I know there's some more projects coming forward. But, we are moving forward on that. But again, we're down to $20 million for all the projects, which certainly isn't not enough for the treatment plant. But I will turn the presentation over to Ryan.
Yes, you have a question?
Yes, I'm sorry, questions?
Yeah, and I guess I'm gonna be quite honest. When you first started and said that 25% right out of billing becomes delinquent, and that becomes on a aging receivable type chart or something, right?
It does, but by the time we get to the second billing, again, most of them have caught up. We saw a lot of progress last year when there was financial assistance due to COVID-19. A lot of customers actually did get caught up, but they just tend to run late. But again, most of them don't go beyond 2 billings. They can catch up, get one done, but again, we do the next billing, well, that one's not getting paid because they're paying the previous one.
Follow up.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Okay, that's good to know. And then the 5 to 7% are outright uncollectible.
Correct.
Is that what we then convert to liens?
Convert to what?
Liens on the properties for unpaid utilities.
It does, yes. I will tell you that when we had the program in place where the property owners were responsible for their tenants, we were actually collecting close to 100%, and in sometimes we were actually collecting more than 100% because we were collecting all the back amounts. But when, that program went, or that, policy went away, again, we went back to 5 to 7% as uncollectible.
Okay, well, I'm not trying to be facetious, but I'm not going to support a rate increase because at the top of these it says, why a rate increase for water and sewer services? Were we really talking about this when we just sat here last month and told the town of Mangonia Park they didn't have to pay? Our charter specifically says no free service. And if there is free service, there has to be a finding, and it has to be a majority plus one, which we didn't accomplish. But we're going to sit here and continue to talk about rate increases on the municipal boundary customers when we don't even go after collecting those folks who, in fact, have the money and chose not to pay us. So this, we can't rob from Peter to pay Paul, especially when Peter has the money. So, I mean, that, for me, is just preposterous to even have this conversation about raising water when we have money on the table that we decide to forgive for whatever reason. And it just, for me, doesn't make sense. And that's not our obligation under the charter or just being public servants and stewards of taxpayer dollars, or in this case, utility district dollars. I'm done, Madam Chair.
Madam Chair.
Yes, thank you. Let me respond to that. I just wanted to say that it's kind of disingenuous of you to say that you didn't get any money from Mangonia Park, because we did. We made a settlement with them to be able to move this process forward, and to say that we are trying to put this on the residents to be able to pay is not correct. What we're doing here is that we know that we have to have $135 million to be able to move forward with a new water plan. And we know we're gonna have to pay for it. But to say that we're putting the burden on the residents is not fair. We made a settlement with Mangonia Park. They did pay us majority of the money that they owed us. The situation here is that it's just like the fire department. Either way, we're gonna have to pay for our services, period. There is no way around it. We're gonna have to pay for the services that we want to have for the city. And what we want to do is to make sure that it does not overburden the residents in the city. We don't want to put them in a situation where they just can't afford to pay it at all. So we want to be able to ease into these different types of financial situations to be able to ease the burden of residents. Even Commissioner Lawson brought up the fact that maybe we need to start smaller and then go higher. That's something that we can consider. But to say we got no money out of Mangonia Park for the water department and for the bill that they had is just not true. And I want the residents to understand that if we are going to move forward with reimagining Riviera Beach, and we're talking about new city halls and new libraries and new water plants and a better fire department and a better police department, then we're going to have to pay for it. And we don't want to be in such debt that our grandchildren are going to have this debt. We want to be able to look at this with a clear head and to be able to ask the residents to participate in moving us forward with seeing the city that we want to have in Riviera Beach and not the one that we think we can have. Go ahead, Mr. Lawson.
Madam Chair, let me fact check you. We
Okay,
collected less than half of the
it's
money
Mr.
that
Lawson's
was
turn
owed.
to talk, sir.
So you're
I
basically
called on Mr.
challenging-
Lawson. I called on
You
Mr. Lawson
challenged
to
what
talk.
I said, but you don't even have the data documents.
I called on
and
Mr. Lawson
evidence.
to have a chance to talk,
So,
sir.
I-
It is
you know-
his opportunity to respond.
Can you defer?
It is his
Councilperson?
opportunity to respond.
Because you just basically challenged
It
what
is
I
his
said.
opportunity to
Can you
respond.
defer, please?
So, to this point, I'm going to ask my questions so that we can move forward with our budget talks. The 13 vacancies, Mr. Sherman, what is the dollar value on those 13 vacancies?
Well, they range all the way right now from the director down to, water plant operators and others. I can get you that number while the presentation is going on. I can run a report and get you a real number on that.
And where are those funds allocated? Where do they go? Do they go back into the general fund at the end of the budget cycle if we don't hire for those positions?
No, the district's funds stay within the district. But again, keep in mind that the FY 2021 budget was predicated on a 6% rate increase. So the expending is based on that budget of, with the increase in it, but the revenues are not generating that 6%. So by not having positions filled, that's saving on the expenditure side, which will hopefully balance off with the revenue side.
Okay, if you could get us a dollar amount for that, the first question. And then the 20 million that we have remaining in capital improvements, how much of that is actually going towards new water plant?
The new water plant?
Mm-hmm.
None of it at this time.
Okay. Is it possible for us to look at deferring some of the capital projects that we have on that 20 million? Because I don't want us just to continue to put a Band-Aid. We're talking about 36 months for a new plant with 20 million sitting in the bank right now. If we can use a minimal amount of that 20 million to begin to move forward with our new plant, and we have an aggressive approach of 24 to 36 months to get the new plant up and running, I don't foresee us spending that 20 million over the next 3 years when we could really apply that to a new plant.
Yeah, and I would say that that's more of a question, to the engineering folks over at the utility district. I mean, I will tell you that, I think they're being very judicious in the projects that they're bringing forward. I think we've heard the engineers say the same thing. What can we do to get us to that 36-month finish line? What can we defer? What can we, hold off on? But again, there are some projects that are critical that they need to bring forward. But yeah, there is the possibility that some of those dollars could go to the plant, but I think at the end of the day, I think you're going to find out that that's, maybe 3 or 4% of the total cost if we even get to that.
I wouldn't make that assumption, Mr. Sherman, simply because those capital funds were not put in place with the intention of having a plant done in 3 years. So if we can move forward with getting an exact amount, we have to turn over every stone to find every dollar. The salaries that we did not spend on those 13 positions need to be going into a new plant. This $20 million, we need to at least spend 75% of that going into our new plant. There's no need for us to continue to put a Band-Aid on something that we did not intend on building within 36 months. But this council is going to get this done within this 2 to 3 year period. So we need to find every dollar, because we're talking about assessing our residents, rate increases and fire assessments, but at the same time, we have money sitting there. We also have to have the discussion when it comes to the money that's coming from the American Plans Act that literally just came down to $7 million with another $7 million coming. That's additional revenue that can go towards this water plant. That is the pressing issue of this council. When we first started, we've talked about water from day one. So we want to make sure that we've addressed every single dollar that we have coming in. If we have vacancies, that money needs to be going to our plant until we fill those positions. If we have 20 million sitting in the bank, it needs to go to our plant. So those have to be the things that we address, and we can't just take a Band-Aid approach anymore. 24 to 36 months is what Mr. Evans spoke to us about, and we're going to believe and trust that he's going to get that done. So with that being said, let's put every dollar we have towards that. But if we can get an amount on what those salaries are, that would be the first approach.
I'll run that while Mr. Smith is making his presentation.
And then while we're actually speaking on that, Mr. Evans, if we can have a discussion during this budget cycle about the American Rescue Plans, anticipating funds of where they're going, because I'm sure you already have a plan in place for infrastructure of where you're going to apply it, but As a council, I want us to address where those funds are going, how we're going to expend those funds, and how quickly we can kind of get those allocated to the things that's necessary.
Absolutely. We have that as part of the discussion, as part of your budget process. So that'll be
Perfect.
something that will.
Thank you, Mr. Evans. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Mr. Evans, for the benefit of the public, could you please provide the public and the council once again with the settlement from Mangonia Park in terms of what was received from the city, what was asked, and so that the public can have a very good understanding of how this settlement happened?
So the recent agreement that we reached with the town of Mangonia Park was to resolve $260,000 that had not been collected, as the town of Mangonia Park was discounting the bill based on previous actions from a previous board, that they believed that there was a discussion and legislative direction to move forward with providing a wholesale rate. In conversations with the city attorney, as well as additional counsel that was obtained to be able to look at the city's position, there was items that were contained that if we went to arbitration, that we can find ourselves in a situation where the $260,000 that the city of Riviera Beach alleges or believes is owed, and the town of Mangonia believes that is not owed, that we can find ourselves in a more vulnerable point. There was some information that was obtained as part of the discovery process that weakened our position, and so with that information, we then began the conversation. I met with the town manager from the town of Mangonia Park, and we were able to effectively resolve what we believed to be something that was amicable and move forward accordingly. The agreement calls for the town of Mangonia Park, which they have provided, $50,000 in cash, and then they also went to a rate of $6.09 per 1,000 gallons. They were originally supposed to pay $5.80 per 1,000 gallons, but since 2018, they were reducing that rate to, I believe, $5.13 per 1,000 gallons. So we made the modification to an agreement with them for 2 years that their rate is going to be $6.09 per 1,000 gallons for a 2-year period, which is anticipated to collect an additional $85,000. So we anticipate that we should receive roughly about, when it's all said and done over the 2-year period, $130,000 plus. Having a rate of 609 allows for us to have that as a baseline for subsequent discussions with the town of Mangonia Park. The concern that we did have is that if this issue wasn't resolved, we can possibly see ourselves in a situation where we are then negotiating from that $5.13 or even that $5.18, where we have changed the arrangement to where we're at 609, and then we only have 2 years to negotiate a long-term agreement. The town of Mangonia Park has already had conversations with other entities about the possibility of hooking up for the purposes of sewer, but it is cost prohibitive for them to do that. And so we've had conversations about a regional approach whereby the city of Riviera Beach can be the exclusive provider, but that's something that we would have some more subsequent conversations with the town of Mangonia Park. So we believe that the arrangement allows for subsequent negotiations to be in a better position versus where we were. And also to note that since 2017, when I was the manager at that time, we collected $330,000 because they had stopped paying, or they were paying a modified rate. And so we collected that in 2017. And then most recently we collected $325,000. And so in over a 4-year span, we've collected roughly about $760-some thousand from the town of Mangonia Park. And to my knowledge, since the agreement, they've been paying the modified rate at the $6.09 per 1,000 gallons, which our residents don't pay that rate. Our residents pay a lower rate.
Thank you. Mr. Sherman, you can
Ready?
continue with
Okay.
your
Madam Chair,
presentation.
can I be permitted to respond?
No, sir, you're not recognized.
Okay, well,
Thank you.
I appreciate that.
So before I turn this over to Ryan Smith, I just wanted to get back to Councilman Lawson. A full year of the vacancies is $631,000. If they were vacant for an entire year. All right. All right, Ryan?
Hi, Randy. How you doing? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. I guess, can we pull up the presentation and I'll start from the first slide, please? Just as a little background, the rate study was completed and finalized in March of 2020. It was actually at the very, very beginning of March. And so this was literally right before COVID hit the city and really the nation. And so that's kind of where these projections were initially put together and then presented to the city. Is the presentation up?
Yes.
Okay, I can't see it. Are we on, which slide are we on? There we go. Okay, great. So just a little background of what a revenue sufficiency study is really it's a balancing act between our revenues and our requirements or funding needs, where those funding needs are our operating expenses, additional personnel, debt, and capital funding, which is typically the biggest item in the utility industry. And then any other kind of compliance issues. And for us, compliance issues being need to maintain an adequate level of debt service coverage, knowing that there's, this large need for debt in the future. And then once we have all those revenue requirements identified, then identifying how are we going to fund that over that same time frame, whether it's from rate revenues, other sources, grants, contributions, whatnot, impact fees, to come up with a balancing act and really a plan that then gets us from where we are today to where we want to be. Next slide, please. Just a little background. These are our existing rates that are in place right now. They've been in place for a number of years, and they really are the 2020 rates. There's really two main components to the rates. There's a base charge, or what you all refer to as a readiness to serve charge. For a residential single-family home, it's $18 for water and $17.54 for wastewater. That represents the minimum bill that a customer would receive. And really, that's there to recover that cost of providing immediate pressurized water service. So, I think about it at any time when
We lost him.
We can't hear.
We lost the sound.
Oh, his connection. Mr. Sherman, you want to either take over or
Sure.
how do you want to do this?
No, I'll take over.
Thank you.
So what we have on this slide, this is our rate structure that we have. And again, when they go through and they do their rate analysis, similar to what you just heard with the fire assessment fee, they're looking at different components of the customers. So we have our single-family rates, we do have a commercial rate, and we have a multifamily rate. The goal is that at the end of the day, when you break this all out, that there's really some equity about what everyone is paying across the line. Commercials are obviously using more water, but again, they pay a higher meter charge, so that meter charge again spreads out over all of the money, the gallons that they are actually using. So again, you see the component here, we do have a water component and a wastewater component, and we break out the irrigation separately. We do bill on a per thousand basis, so when we read those meters, we are only charging for a full 1,000 gallons and not the portion over 1,000 between the next 1,000 gallons. The system attributes that we are for 2020, we brought in almost $2 million. The rate revenues were actually 96%, again, as we mentioned with 2020, because there was a lot of assistance being provided. We were at 96%. The water, 57 breaks out between 57% and 39% of that rate is sewer. Very little money comes in from other fees, as you can see in the chart. That really doesn't cover a lot. It's the connection fees, and it's really more specific charges relating to specific issues being reimbursed by the customers. On the operating expense side, again, as we talked about earlier, you have all of the revenues, and then you have the operating revenues. So as you can see, $19.5 million was the operational part. That was 72% of the rates that we brought in. The ECR is 18% of our total operating expenses. And then, he's pointing out here that, there's very little control over a lot of the operating expenses, such as our utility costs. That we have to pay. And the pilot that is charged to the customers is 6% of the total revenues. So as we start to look at the fund balance, what he's trying to show on this slide is really the need for dollars to support the capital. So again, this is goes back to 2020, so this does not necessarily take into account 2021. But if you go down the table on the right-hand side, with our operating and our capital budgets, we started 2020 with about $78 million in fund balance. Go through that, you have to take out of that fund balance the amount of dollars that we owe the customers back for their deposits. We can't count the impact fees. You back out the bond proceeds that we were sitting at that point, which was $31 million. 180 days of our operational expense is set aside in reserves for a case of emergencies. And then we also have our capital reserves, which is equal to 1 year of our depreciation. So what that really means is that our funds that are restricted for capital are $46 million. Add in the funding that we had in our CIP projects of $31.8 million, and then all of the CIP that we had for the $152 million means we're looking for about $120 million for future capital spending. Now, if you recall, we actually have the plant at about $121 million. So that's really about where we are. So other than the plant, or an amount equivalent to the plant, we really have the capital dollars covered that are in the CIP. It's really those dollars that we're looking for the water treatment plant. Just again, a little bit of recap on the capital side. What you have in the table over there, again, you can see that we have $111 million of bond proceeds for the treatment plant built into that number. And again, remember when they did this initial study, we were actually looking at the treatment plant in 2025. Remember the study started before we purchased the property on Blue Heron. We were looking at replacing the facility at its current location. Now that we have the new parcel and we can expedite that process, That bar chart on the right there, which would be the capital spending on the water treatment facility, would actually now be shifting over to 2023. So the rates that the consultant has come up with are really geared more to 2025. We can do some things when we issue the debt as far as things such as capitalizing the interest. We can defer the payment up to a year as we go. But that's really the goal, and that's what he is trying to reflect on this slide. Now, there are a couple of points when they look at the rates that they have to consider. So what they do is they actually build the model. They'll build the model, again, just similar to what you heard with the fire fee, out 5 years. They don't build the model past 5 years, as things really tend to get unpredictable once you go past that 5-year period. And they build it out, they look at the operations, they'll look at the ECR budgets, they will, again, look at your capital needs. And then what they end up coming out to, building it backwards, is here's my expenses, here's the known revenues that we have, what is my revenue requirement in order to meet that budget. So if you're looking at this chart again, 2020, they have actually updated the numbers and then projected forward for 2021 through 2025. The light green at the bottom, that's your operating expenses. The darker green is the ECR. The blue is the debt service. And if you look out at 2025, that's where you start to see the increase in the debt service to pay for the new facility. The results of their calculations and projections, again, just looking at the table at the bottom, the third line down, it is, again, their recommendation that it be 2021 at 6%, which obviously did not occur, and then it was 6% for each of the next 4 years after that. What that'll do is it'll cover the growth in operations. It'll start to build the rates up, so by the time you get to the point where you're making debt service, the total rate is sufficient to make that debt service payment. In the process of building the rates up, if there is surplus cash brought in between the revenues and the operations, that surplus cash through the flow of funds actually falls down into additional pay-as-you-go capital. Okay? Does not come to the general fund, it stays in the district, and those dollars in the process of building up to the debt service would be available for capital spending. The rate comparisons, they've gone out, our average residential customer, and this is the average, uses 6,000 gallons of water every month. Obviously, there are those that use 1,000 and 2,000, and there are those that are using $10,000 to $12,000. But on average, we are at $6,000 a month. So what they've reflected on here is the average bills for all of these communities based off of $6,000. So as you can see, the average of all the communities right now is $74.24. That is the line that you see going across the screen. The current rate for 6,000 gallons in Riviera Beach is $69.21. And with the proposed rate increase, the first 6% would bring that rate up to $73.37. What's not reflected on here are the out years, again, because we're comparing it just to the current rates of the other communities. But again, even with that first 6%, it would keep us below the average of the other communities as of today. And again, those other communities, I'm sure, also have rate increases programmed into the out years. What this slide does is it shows you the breakdown between the current rate, which is the stacked bar graph on the left, and what they are recommending that you need out in 2025. The light green at the bottom, again, those are the operational expenses, so we're looking at that going from $47 out of that $69 that we were just talking about to $57. So that's about a 20% increase in operational expenses over the next 5 years. The wastewater is at $10 right now, and that would go up to $12 over the 5-year period. The $11, that blue area that you see, $11 in 2020, it remains $11 in 2025. That is the debt service on the current bonds that are outstanding at the district. And then the $18 at the end is the debt, is the revenues that are required to pay the debt service on the new facility. So that $18 as compared to the $69 is that 26% that I mentioned earlier. In developing, the rates, again, they want to try to make sure that, the community is maintaining its strong fiscal position. So they've compared the margins between the revenues and operations compared to the Fitch medians for a AA credit. And as I mentioned earlier, the utility district is an A+ credit. So that orange line up there is for a AA credit. And again, when they're building the lines, they're keeping that into consideration so they don't cause any issues with our credit rating. They're also looking at that debt coverage. So again, where I mentioned we're required to have, in essence, a 20% cushion after we take in our operating revenues, we pay our operating expenses. We're supposed to have our debt service balance remaining plus 20%. Answer the question of, well, what happens to that 20%? It stays in the district, it flows to the bottom line, and again, that is available for capital projects, pay as you go.
Did I hear that the gentleman was back? Okay.
Well, now that we don't need him anymore.
Is Ryan back on?
Okay, wait, you're muting my audio on Zoom or?
Yes, we can hear you, sir. Maybe he can't hear us.
Hey everyone, sorry about that.
Okay,
I don't know what happened, but we're back now. Can we go back to slide number 3, which is where I think I had lost you guys.
No.
No.
Sir, we have
We went through the whole thing already.
we have gone through basically this whole presentation, but if you want to kind of take us back through from number 3, we'll.
That was the easiest presentation I've ever given there.
I know, right? So
And he
maybe
did a
you
very
can just
good
kind
job.
of just give us a brief. Mr. Sherman has basically, told us about each of these slides, but if you want to just kind of do an overview of each of these slides and kind of, move it along, we will listen.
Yeah, I can do that.
Ryan, which slide do you want?
Well, why don't we just actually, we can start right here on revenue requirements.
Okay.
So, guys, just a little bit of background, right? We finished the study in March of 2020. Literally, it was at the very, very beginning of March, right before COVID hit. At that point in time, we had a lot of unknowns. We knew we had a lot of existing capital needs that were on the near term. We had improvements that had to be done at the existing water plant just to meet the requirements of DEP and to, basically to keep the water plant providing potable water until we could build a new plant. And then we had that giant need out there for a new plant. We had estimated it at $120 million, $130 million in total, which is a big, big number. You know, do I know if it's going to end up being we get it cheaper and we can do it for 110, or does it come in more expensive and it's 150? We don't know, but we know it's not going to be a $10-20 million project. It's going to be very, very significant. So what we said is, well, at that point in time, you know, let's come up with what are our rate options if we know that that's where we need to go. Option number one is we do nothing. We wait until we get to, you know, at the very last minute and we do a rate increase. At that point in time, what we came up with was a 34% adjustment out there in 2024. Or the second option was to do a levelized phased adjustment over 5 years, which what we had identified at the point in time was 6% per year for the next 5 years to get us to a sufficient point out there in 2025 to be able to issue the debt. Now, that did two things for us, really. First, it started to build up a little bit of capital, extra cash to be able to buy down how much we have to borrow. So I think instead of borrowing the whole 130 million, we were able to only borrow 120 million. So it brought that down a little bit. The second thing, and really the purpose of why we would want to do a levelized plan, is it shows to the rating agencies that we have a plan, we've implemented it, and we're sticking to it. You know, because the one thing that we don't want to have happen is we do not want to be downgraded. We want the rating agencies to come in and to see that we've come up with a plan and we've been implementing it, and that way that they see that, you know, the utility has has set its goal and is working to meet them. You know, one of the things that, you know, that was really working to do was to try to maintain that level of debt service coverage out there in the future once you did issue that debt. You know, and really what we had when at that point in time too, we had talked with the financial advisors. You know, you guys use PFM or Public Financial Management, and they had recommended a target before we issue of trying to maintain about a 2.0 coverage ratio. And that's kind of where you were, you know, before 2020, you know, you really were up at that level, you know, of, you know, above a 2.0. And so that's where we tried to keep you at with that rate study. You know, so now since that point in time, right, we've had COVID. We've had a pretty significant amount of increase in uncollectibles, you know, kind of like what Randy has mentioned. And time's gone on and we didn't implement the 6% adjustment got rescinded. So now we're coming to 2022. We've got a shorter window, and we still know that, yes, there's a big need out there. Is there monies that could be available to bring that total cost of the plant down? Absolutely. There's grants out there. You know, there's the COVID monies that may be available. There's a number of things we may be able to, you know, negotiate and get a lower price than what we had assumed. But still, we know that's a very, very substantial amount. And so our thought was originally is it's better for us to implement the plan and to start moving forward now. And then that way, if we get to 24, we get to 25, and we're ahead of the game and we don't need those last adjustments, we could always suspend them at that point in time. And that's kind of in a nutshell, you know, what we came up with, you know, back at the beginning of 2020. So now we're coming back to you, you know, just to say, like, here's the plan that we had. Where should we go? You know, or what should be the next steps that the next direction that we take for the utility? Was that summarized enough?
Yep.
Oh, that's here. Go ahead, sir. Are you asking us a question?
Oh, no, I was just kind of wrapping up that, you know, we came up with two rate
was
plans
rhetorical.
either.
Oh, okay, it was a rhetorical question. All right, very good.
Sorry. So
Yes,
was
thank
there any questions, or did you all want me to go through all of the slides, or?
No,
We
if
got
there are
through
any
'em.
questions, we can have them at this time.
Yeah.
For the board, are there any questions for this presenter?
No, I have a question for Mr. Evans.
Okay, go ahead.
Thank you. So, Mr. Evans, what's our next step in terms of informing the community about this, and how quickly can we move forward?
So we can certainly convene as staff and look to have a meeting with the community, of course, providing for adequate notice. Mr. Sherman, to put some notification in the utility bills to make sure we capture all the cycles. What would that be time frame wise? Because we're looking probably sometime in middle July that we would be able, I think, to meet all to hit all the cycles.
Well, it'd be the first week of July would be the final cycle. So you could probably say the third week of July, you know.
Good.
To have a meeting?
You know, I think that's the week of the
What, to have a
19th,
community
19th
meeting?
or something like that, yeah.
Yeah, so we can possibly have a, two community meetings in July, and then queue that up for discussion with the board in August.
Okay.
That could work, yes. Are there any other questions from the board in regards to this presentation?
Yes, Madam Chair.
Yes, go ahead, sir.
Mr. Evans or Mr. Sherman, would you be able to give us or get to us the amount of rate increases we've had on the water over the last 10 years?
Yes, yeah, I can provide that, certainly.
Okay. I want us, when we're going into these community charrettes, to have a end goal for our residents. Right now, looking at the water rate increases, our concern is that residents don't want to pay an increased water and have the same dilapidated buildings. So if we're looking at a 24 to 36 month approach, and realistically coming to them to say, hey, we have a water plant and we have the finish line just outside of our reach, but we need your assistance, we need your support, we need to get it to this level, I think we can get a better buy-in. And then also looking at a conservative rate increase versus something that's going to be an immediate impact, kind of similar to what we talked about earlier with possibly stretching it over the next 5 to 10 years at a lower percentage that slowly increases so that we can work on additional funding streams. One of the things, and the second question, follow-up, Madam Chair, would be for the looking at some of the surrounding unincorporated areas, because if we can look at some possible municipal annexation with some of the areas, I believe Gramercy Park, that can assist with our ad valorem tax, it can assist with some of the revenue that we have. If we have a brand new water plant, that gives us more of a leg up to go ahead and bring in some of this property into the city and have our city coffer increase with the opportunity of offsetting some of the expenses that we have. The additional funding streams that we have to look at are going to be like the parking, the cell phone towers, the upgrading service fees, grant writing department. So I want to make sure that we have addressed every possibility that we can actually move forward with.
Madam Chair?
Yes, go ahead.
Certainly, we can share with the board or the community multiple options and what we're looking at as it relates to funding streams. With regards to annexation, if we do annex, we benefit on the property tax side, but we actually lose revenue if we annex parcels that are paying that 25% surcharge. So there is that situation where, yes, they would, in essence, receive municipal services on a voluntary annexation, but they pay us 25% surcharge to the city if they're outside of the municipal boundary. So the revenue actually goes down on the user fee, but you collect it on property tax on the other side. But the annexation process has become a lot more complicated and cumbersome than it used to be. But we certainly can share with the community what the long-term plans and how aggressive we want to move. And realistically, the plan that we have as it relates to the American Rescue Plan is to invest that $15 million of the $7.5 million that we have now into moving forward with the utility district. So you will actually see construction activities on the site and then obviously subsequent activities associated with the new water plant coming out of the ground. So we do want to show the community that we are moving forward in an aggressive manner to effectively improve the water quality and the conditions for the district in the very near future. So we are prepared and ready to have that conversation and provide all types of options and exercises so the community knows exactly what's going on and what the intent is.
Follow up, Madam Chair.
Yes, go ahead.
Thank you. So, Mr. Evans, for clarity on that 25% service charge that we're receiving on the utility district side, you're talking about on the water bills and the waste water?
That is correct.
So even though that's a 25% loss that we would receive on water bills, I think adding property tax for all of those parcels would be a substantial increase. So I guess it would be kind of disingenuous to say that we'd be losing because we'd be bringing a substantial amount of revenue in regard to property tax, which could assist on the city side tremendously.
Madam Chair, if I may?
Go ahead.
But it wouldn't help the district because we're talking exclusively to the district. You wouldn't, it's an enterprise fund, so the funds utilized from the utility is utilized exclusively for the business operations associated with it. So I did say that you would see an increase on ad valorem side, and then you would see a situation where you would lose the 25% surcharge. But also the other side of it is invariably you have to convince someone that's not paying city taxes that would end up seeing their taxes increase. So again, annexation is something we've already had the conversation from the staff level as to how do we look at getting some voluntary annexation agreements in place to move forward with that. But then ultimately that's selling city services and the benefits associated with city services, because those persons that are outside are not paying city taxes. They are paying the 25% surcharge. And so they may see, there may be situations or instances where their tax bills would increase, and that's always a challenge on selling. But nonetheless, we are having a conversation to address that, especially some of the type A enclaves we have in our community.
Any other questions in regards to this presentation? Very good. We can move on. Next item on the agenda, Mr. Evans, is there anything else other than comments and discussion?
Just to summarize the discussion, these are the only items that we've brought forth for discussion this evening, Madam Chair.
All right, very good. Then we can go to discussions by the city manager.
Yes, Madam Chair and members of the board, obviously we have gotten some insight and some perspectives from the board as to how you wish to move forward with both these particular issues, and that will result in some community conversations and discussions, and then we will bring that back in a formal setting for more discussions with the board. We will make sure that there is adequate notice that is provided for both those meetings, and so there may be some type of a joint marketing or communication pieces that go out all through the city's marketing channels to ensure there is adequate time. So we may utilize the same process to put some mailers in the utility bills, as well as utilizing our code red to inform persons about when these meetings will take place. We will make sure that we look at possibly 2 locations to host the meeting, and then obviously allow for some type of participation in a remote setting if that is all possible. So as we look to build out the budget, of course, we will have subsequent and more robust conversations with the board. I will be looking to schedule individual meetings with the board as well as it relates to some specific items that you would like to see discussed or incorporated as part of the budget conversations. But at this particular moment, that concludes staff's presentation for this evening. And thank you for the information, the input that you've provided us, because it does help us in building out the budget for discussion at your subsequent budget workshops.
Thank you. Any response or questions from the city attorney?
No, Chair, thank you.
Very good. Comments, discussion. We'll start with Mr. Councilman Lawson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Evans, the new agenda, the new schedule that went out for the budget sessions, we're going to be starting, I believe we're moving it to July. Is it the proposed budget or, proposed schedule, or have we finalized that?
That is correct. Ms. Mitchell has sent out an email to the board, and I haven't had an opportunity to speak to her prior to this meeting. So assuming that there's no conflicts with prior obligations of the board, that will be the schedule that we would look to proffer.
Okay.
Madam Chair,
So,
I'm sorry.
no, go ahead. Go ahead.
So, yes, she did send something out, but unfortunately, there were no times associated with the dates.
Correct.
So I'm just wondering, would it be proper to assume, I know one should never do that, but would it be proper to assume that the Saturdays are full days, but the Wednesdays are starting at 6?
That is correct.
Okay. So we are not having budget workshops on June 23rd or June 30th or July 7th, correct?
That is correct.
Thank you.
Very good. Mr. Lawson?
Yes, sorry, that was my question in regards to just adding the times to send out for us, and then also those dates. Timeframe wise, when would you like to, looking at these dates, when are we looking to approve our budget based upon these new dates that she sent out?
The month of August is primarily the time when we bring the board the budget for consideration.
Okay. All right, thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you. Councilman McCoy?
Yes. Thank you, Madam Chair. So I guess I'll take this opportunity to finish my comments since I didn't do it earlier. Ms. Busby, did you have an opportunity to look at what I brought to your attention in the charter? If not, then I'll certainly bring it up at another time. But I wanted to specifically ask about the free service provision in the majority plus one, because there seems to be some confusion. Do you have have you had time to review that, Ms. Busby?
What are you asking about? I'm not sure. I'm not
I'm
following.
asking Ms. Busby a question.
No, I mean, you're talking about for this meeting?
Yes, relative to rate increases, water increases, and,
Okay.
and free service.
Chair, may I address the question?
Yes, go ahead.
Thank you. Councilperson McCoy, you just provided me the section 4.10 of the USD Charter, and our office can do a legal...
I'm having difficulties hearing you.
Our office can do a legal opinion to you addressing your concerns. In order to do that, we just needed some time, and we can draft that and send that to you. But could you provide what section of 4.10 you're referencing?
Well, actually, it's probably going to be a little bit more than 4.010, but that deals with free service. There is another section that establishes utility rate classes, and specifically in the case of the settlement agreement and the 6.09% that has been offered to the town of Mangonia Park doesn't necessarily constitute us taking the action to do a rate class, and whether or not it benefits the entire system, because we do have also the town of Mangonia Park who essentially was already in that same rate class with the with the town of Mangonia Park, and Palm Beach Shores was in the same rate class, and now the establishments of the settlement agreement on its surface, and I think quite frankly, legally, is in contravention of what the charter requires. So I'm specifically speaking to the free services and the establishment of rate classes in those respects.
Thank you, Councilperson McCoy. Our office will do a legal review and respond back to you with alacrity.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Is that it, Mr. McCoy?
Yes.
Thank you. Commissioner Botel?
No, thank you.
Commissioner Miller Anderson?
No, thank you.
And we are adjourned.